Peasant perceptions, some may say, are unattainable. Because peasants left just a light trace of their presence, it is true that uncovering their observations about the experiences of their daily lives is difficult, but it isn't impossible. If we look carefully, even now, we can still see faint traces of their presence in the rural landscape through evidence that survives into the modern period.
There are clues to England's medieval past in all our villages and towns, through road signs and field names, and of course through fossilised ridge and furrow. Here we are in Caster's Norman Gate. This road sign alludes back to Caster's medieval past, and there are clues like this all around us in England's villages and towns.
These church capitals, carved in the 12th century, also tell us something about peasant experience. Modern viewers will recognise many of these incredible animals, such as this fantastic boar that we can see here being chased down by a pack of hunting dogs, being driven onto the spear of the hunter. This scheme also features what we would perhaps describe as supernatural creatures, including dragons and basilisks. What's really exciting about these images, though, is that they offer us a glimpse of the 12th century landscape as it was perceived by Caster's peasant population.
From the later Anglo-Saxon period, there was a greater sense of hierarchy apparent in the medieval village. Lords sought to differentiate themselves from the lower orders, and this began by them thinking about the way that their dwelling houses looked, wanting to ensure that they were lordly in appearance. Later on, they sought to distance themselves further, sometimes moving manorial sites, manorial curia, away from peasant dwellings. The area that we're standing in now in Caster is one of the oldest parts of the settlement. We're just above the church, and this area here was almost certainly the site of the Torald manorial complex. Torald was one of the minor knights created when William the Conqueror insisted on the creation of several knights' fees associated with Peterborough Abbey. And you can see that the road system bifurcates around this area, effectively separating that part of the settlement away from the dwellings of the peasants, which would have been in this area here. Charters also tell us a great deal about the way that peasants lived. This amazing charter from 13th century Caster tells us about an incredible peasant homestead and messuage here in Caster. It tells us, for instance, that it was surrounded by fences, walls and ditches, that it contained an orchard and a great garden, that it was accessed through a great gate. And so straight away we start to build up quite a rich picture of the way in which this particular peasant, Reginald de Pickworth, must have lived back then in Caster.
Charters were generally the preserve of free tenants, and this description would not have been typical of all peasant dwellings, with many living on smaller plots and having less autonomy over their tofts. So this helps us to see that peasants' experience of living in rural England was far from uniform. In Lakenheath, where the landscape was split between poor Breckland soils and peat fen, the better-off peasants were almost all sheep farmers, whilst the poorer residents were more likely to include fishing in their economic activities. Poorer peasants were also more likely to trade in manure, an important commodity necessary for improving soil conditions, vitally important in a community like Lakenheath.
Here in Elton, we know that certain peasant status groups lived separately. We're now standing by Elton Church in Elton's Overend, and this was part of the proto-manor of John de Aylington, and he set up an area specifically for his cottage holders, his cottars, not too far from where we're standing now. This peasant zoning would have had a significant impact on the way that peasants saw themselves and their fellow residents. Ideas that are generated from the lords about their sense of place in the medieval landscape must at some level have filtered down to the peasants, and we see that coming through in peasant naming practices. So in Huntingdonshire in particular, free peasants were not happy to associate themselves with the topography of the Vill, names like Atter Brook and In the Lane, for example. These are important ideas to explore because they tell us a great deal about the ways that peasants interacted with each other and their relationship with the rural landscape in the later Middle Ages. Names are a really important piece of evidence for a study of this nature, and I think that their importance cannot be overstated. The parchment rolls in which we find things like peasant bynames and field names may have recorded these only very fleetingly, but they give us a glimpse into the world as seen by the peasants themselves. So names like Castor's Rywong and Elton's Peaswong and perhaps Lakenheath's Sheepwash tell us something, for instance, about the economy. Important resources are encapsulated in names like Lakenheath's Woodfen or Castor's Ling, which references the heather that would have been gathered as a very important resource there. But economic resources aren't the only things that are recorded in field names. A beautiful image is conjured up by Elton's Butterfly Mead, the Butterfly Meadow, and of course Castor's Thur's Pit, the Giant's or Demon's Pit, conjures up an image of a supernatural world that we can only imagine. Documents give us all kinds of exciting insights into the peasant world. Here we've got a charter. This is from Elton. It's 14th century, and it's absolutely full of field names, really exciting field names, and these were all coined by peasants. So we begin to get a really interesting insight into the ways in which they thought about and named the landscape. So here we've got Clay Furlong, another one here at Waterfalls and Long Hill, and this absolutely beautiful name, Husband's Slade Overend. Absolutely beautiful names that tell us a great deal about how we can access peasant mentalities from this period.
Peasants' own names, their bynames and family names, are also associated with the landscape, increasingly so from the 13th century onward. These names connect individuals and families with specific parts of the rural landscape. Caudle's Place and Bernard's Place were the names of dwellings in Castor, so clearly reflecting the built environment. But all sorts of landscape features were named, like the Hithe, the landing place, in Lakenheath called Gopayne's Hithe, named by the family that held this plot. And we've already seen on the beautiful Elton Charter the evocative name Husband's Slade Overend, which reflects a valley, the upper end of a valley, associated with a person called Osborne.
One of the most exciting things about studying the Middle Ages and thinking about the Middle Ages is that they had a completely different worldview to the way that we look at the world today. So the landscape is populated with what we might term today as supernatural beings, and we've got evidence of that here in Castor, and in fact alongside Ermine Street we have an exciting field which is called Thur's Pit, and this means the Giant's or the Demon's Pit. Now, we think that it was probably a quarry associated with the construction of the Roman road, but of course medieval people in the later Anglo-Saxon and early post-conquest period would have needed a way to have explained this strange pit alongside the road. Field names are incredibly important if we're going to think about the way that peasants understood the landscape and the way that they worked the landscape. We're here in Elton, and this is a place that was once called Molwell Hill. It's a field name of 3 words: mol, which is gravelly soil, weller, which comes from the spring, which is over here, and of course the hill that you can see quite clearly. Now, this sounds like a very descriptive name. Perhaps to some it might sound like a very boring name, but in fact from a landscape history perspective it's really quite exciting, because it does give us a really perfect description of this field. If you look at the terrain on the brow of the field at the top, you'll see that it's covered in limestone brash, very gravelly soil indeed. Now, thinking about this as part of the open field system, a very small part of the whole open field system, imagine how peasants remembered how to treat each particular field. And field names like Molwell Hill encapsulate important environmental information, which help them to do that quite easily.
This isn't the only way that minor landscape names work in a mnemonic capacity. It's long been known that historically the landscape acted as a repository for local cultural memory. We only have to think, for example, of the major oak in Sherwood to conjure up images of Robin Hood in our mind's eye. The field names in the Normangate area of Castor sound fairly innocuous to modern ears: Normangate, Denishmore, Walwortwong. In the book, I link these places with the action depicted in this capital, which points strongly toward a violent event here in Castor before the 12th century.
Using a variety of different evidence, including documents, archaeological evidence like material culture, place names, and of course the landscape itself, this study hopes to demonstrate that the recovery of peasant experience is a realistic and attainable